So let's go and take a look at the how these intersections are working a bit more clearly. So if we go back to maybe our central facing tetrahedrons and their PSUs. These 6 PSUs, and we'll just take our tetrahedrons out of the way to make it a bit easier to see. And our box. And if you remember, I just select our central one. We had quite large intersections going on here between the two. Which I should say, I only mentioned again, of course, these intersections are what effectively form the petals when we start to see the flower of life pattern. Let's take a look at how those are actually working. I can illustrate them. There we are. So you can look at it that way. We can see here, if I can just select one, so you can see how the central PSU and this PSU intersect in this kind of shape, this sort of, I don't know what to call that shape, maybe someone knows what that's called. It's a kind of rounded out disc, I guess, but maybe it's a lot easier just to see it rather than me try and describe it. You can see clearly what kind of shape we're getting there. So we're getting, of course, 6 of those. Let's just switch off our PSUs so we can see clearly just the intersections that are going on. And I just select a few of them, you can start to see how they all start to connect together into this central PSU. Now you can see when I do this as well, maybe more clearly, the flower of life petals beginning to emerge in terms of those intersections. That's also interesting to note, and this is something that Tom was pointing out, that there's a kind of central space within the PSU that won't be intersected by anything. It actually is kind of, just illustrate that there, solidifying that. It's kind of a cubic shape. It's slightly curved, of course, because each of these intersections is curved. It's got that kind of interesting nature. And what Tom saw was that you can actually take the intersection points which appear here as the corners of this sort of bendy cube, and if you define them out as what we call a minor cube, you have a cube that sits inside the our central tetrahedron. I'll just turn these off so you can see that a bit more clearly. And it's a cube that is effectively the I forget the phrase now. It's like the opposite of the tetrahedron. When we take the each face of the tetrahedron, if we take a central point within each face, we can define 3 of these cube vertexes, and then if you draw a cube out from there, you naturally get this this central cube that fits inside the tetrahedron. Also, if we look, another way of looking at that relationship, which Tom noticed, is its relationship to the cube we were looking at earlier, the major cube that sits around the tetrahedron. If I just bring out a couple more of those inner cubes, you can see there's exactly 3 that would span across a major cube, so of course it's a 1/3 sized space we've got in there, and that relates exactly to the relationship of the major cubes when looking originally at how we put them around our central tetrahedron or our central PSU, and that we got that Rubik's Cube type affair with 26 around the central one. You would have exactly the same fractal relationship in here with these cubes, which is an intriguing part of the geometry. Tom has very clearly discovered there. But let's get back to our intersections. Let's get rid of our cubes for now. Let's just look where we were. We were taking a look at these intersections. Now, of course, there were the edge intersections as well, if you remember, those 12 PSUs that had small intersections. If I just go back to look at those. And if you remember, we're getting similar kind of thing, but they're smaller because these spheres are further away. Each one in exactly the same aspect to the central one. So we can look at those again a bit more clearly. And if I can just get hold of one, there we go. So you can see similar shape but smaller going there. How each of these 12 will intersect that central one. And if we can turn these off, and we can see here we've got these 12 intersections. And the 6 around the centre, and then the 3 above and below. Again, if I select them all with this highlighting, you can maybe see a bit more clearly. Again, we get this petal pattern appearing in the intersections, though it's a bit smaller than our larger intersections. But if we turn them all on together, of course, they are intersecting at the same point. So you'll see we get this nice interlocking pattern of 3 large intersections and 3 small intersections. And if we just start by, let's take a look at the smaller intersections. Just select 2 of them there. We can see how this is going to intersect if we made it into an element. It would have this 3-sided shape where these 2 cut together, and this petal shape on the surface of the central PSU. So that's 2 PSUs intersecting with our central one, so 3 intersecting all together, of course. If we look at the major intersections, on the other hand, similar again, much deeper point where they would come together here inside the PSU, which would be part of the definition of this inner cube. But also we should take note of the fact that there's actually something else going on with each of these intersections. There's a... Let me get hold of him. There we go. There's a minus intersection that sits right over that point as well, literally from end to end. So really what we have here is not just the 2 major PSU faces intersecting, but also the one from the edge. So we really should use that to show where not only these 2 but 3 PSUs are intersecting with this central PSU. So we'll actually end up with a not a 3-sided but a 4-sided kind of petal here. We'll have the 2 sides and then this. Whoops, try not to make it too confusing. And then where this, get back to you, there we are. where our minor one will then cut into what would have been quite a deep aspect of just taking those two major ones. You can see the curve of the minor one coming across here. That'll form the fourth face of that petal. So interesting to look and see how that actually looks. If I switch these off and bring up, these are the major intersections. So I've actually done that, as I was just pointing out, and you can see how these all, of course, join together, and straight away we get both our flower of life pattern emerging. We look at it one way, and we get our cubic pattern if we look at it from another angle. So it contains both. Yes, something to note. We'll come back onto that in a second. Let's just look at these smaller intersections. If we also show those, you can see, of course, those are appearing at the same intersection points, but they're smaller, so they don't actually connect with each other. They just form an interesting subsidiary pattern at each of those intersection points. If I just for now, if I solidify those a bit, it might be easier to see. So we're getting this as the kind of intersection pattern within any individual PSU sphere. Now, we also had our spheres that were at tangents, and it's interesting to note, because of the geometry, that these, I'll just switch them on again. Let's look at our, in terms of our tangencies, that would have been these tetrahedrons. Let's just put our here for a second, our central tetrahedron. You can see that these points of intersection are, of course, where these corner tetrahedrons or vertex tetrahedrons, well, remember there were 8 of them, because we're looking at it in that way as a cube makes it easy to remember. We've got our 8 corners of a cube, and you can see that each of these points is a point where these corner elements meet our central PSU. In terms of the PSUs, of course, remember we had a gap, some of them because of the geometry. In terms of those PSUs, let's just switch that on. And you can see clearly with these as well, of course, it's that tangency point where this whole intersection is occurring, which we'll just use that to look at this in a slightly different way in a minute. But that is part of the way it all comes together. Let's switch these off. Get back to our idea here. Now we can extrapolate that out, of course, which I've done here. We can start to see how that would begin to form a pattern as we look at all the PSUs together. Again, if you've got glitches here, because things are overlaying, but hopefully that won't stop you seeing the kind of pattern that's beginning to form there. And again, of course, there's the flower of life if we look at it at one aspect, and we've got our cubic look if we look at it from another aspect. So yes, let's just take a look at the idea of this as individual points of intersection. Now you can see here, you can start to see anyway, let's take one down here for example. In fact, I'll just turn these down a little because it will help with some of this glitching. And I'll get rid of you just there. You can see where we have a complete set of elements coming together. It's hard to see in the setup, we'll look at it slightly differently in a second. We could look at it that way, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Instead of looking at it as individual PSUs, we could look at these points of intersection between the PSUs and actually use that as a definition as well, or how we could build a bigger picture. So what do I mean by that exactly? Well, let's just switch this on. There we are, gone upside down, should be something near the top. And I could take, and just select that, it's maybe a bit clearer. I could take those intersection points and we can actually see what's happening at each intersection point, which involves all of those intersecting PSUs, the central one and the 6 faces and the 12 edge PSUs will all be forming these patterns. And we get, as you may expect, we get 6 large petals. But interestingly, we actually get not 6 smaller petals, but we get 8, because of course these are being formed by the 12 edges. So we actually get a different aspect from different angles for those smaller petals. So we get this 6 by 8 flower element. I'm going to switch these off and we can focus on looking at things this way. A couple of interesting points about this individual flower intersection. When we look at the major 6 petals, we do find that I can just get it out of here, here we go. We do find that they very nicely form an octagon. If you take their point of definition, again that just falls out of the geometry. Again, one of those really interesting things where there's geometry, you can dig into it more and more things start emerging. And the central one, of course, then you may imagine already, because we've got 8 petals there, we could look at that either as another cube or as a star tetrahedron pattern sitting inside there. So again, we're looking at another level of geometric possibility in here. Interestingly, this cube does turn out to be relative to the ones that Tom has defined, his major cube and his minor cube being 1/3. This cube is actually a 2/3 size relationship to the major cube. So more sort of patterns emerging there. Anyway, let's take a wider look at this. I'll switch you off. We can of course just clone these out and start to see a bit more clearly what's going on. So I've made a whole set of them here corresponding to some of our grid, and let's just have a look a little more clearly at what's going on with the flower of life pattern. Now you can see that here beginning to emerge. They of course because of the nature of the flower of life in 3D, we don't get this, if I just bring it back up quickly, we don't get this very precise way that it is, that it appears in 2D with our central point that is an exact intersection. We get this kind of overlapping look because these elements are not formed in 2D but in 3D, and they all bend into each other, so we get this rather chunky flower of life pattern emerging, which is in itself quite interesting as it forms a minor pattern within it, and so on and so on. And of course, not only have we got the flower of life, but we've also got the cubic element in there as well. Looking at a certain aspect, we get a cubic grid emerging. So I think it's pretty clear. You can always look at this in two different ways. Now, let's just bring this one back up. If we take our pattern, let's just look at what I'm doing here, if it's not clear. Of course, this is sitting around our original grid. And if we build it out to match the entire 64 tetrahedron grid, we start to get this emerging as the whole thing begins to bloom with these intersection points. And of course we could also look at that in terms of our PSUs that are of course what are actually forming the grid. Our tetrahedrons up. So we have this wonderful new way of looking at the whole setup with this flower and petal pattern, of which I'm sure there's a lot more to be discovered. And just say thanks to Tom particularly for bringing all this out and making it something that was easy to investigate, and also to Eric for his comments, and not forgetting Marshall, who's created the whole forum for this in the first place.